Is Cincinnati becoming the next DBU of college football?
Our Locked On Bearcats, your daily podcast on the Cincinnati Bearcats, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And thank you for making Locked On Bearcats your first listen of every day. It's free and available everywhere you get your podcasts and on YouTube, where we are up to 236 subscribers and counting. Hit that subscribe button. Follow us to get an alert every time we drop a new episode. He is back, a friend of the show, a friend of the college channel of the Locked On Podcast Network, and that is none other than the director of football recruiting for Sports Illustrated, John Garcia Jr. John, is it true that our channel manager at the college channel, Locked On Podcast Network, Zach Blackerby, he told us that he's convinced you have every college scouting director's phone number in your phone? Is that true?
I cannot confirm nor deny those reports. We've got a handful for sure that we utilize because it's been frantic. I mean, a lot of teams are red hot, Cincinnati, of course, included on the trail. It's been a lot keeping up with this, but it's been fun while we see these kids fulfill their dreams of locking in a commitment to a college program. So, yeah, we definitely use our resources as much as possible, though. That's safe to say.
Clearly, John Garcia Jr., you do. And speaking of Cincinnati being red hot on the recruiting trail, give us your overall thoughts, because last time you and I talked was before the slew of commits from the official visits that took place the first 2 weekends of this month of June. So give us your thoughts on the Bearcats 2023 class.
Well, certainly, as you teased in the open, Alex, a lot of DBs are headed to Cincinnati. There's certainly an easy sell there, given what we just saw on the field and in the draft relative to the Bearcats. But it's not just DBs that Cincy is bringing in. This is going to be a very balanced class. We've seen an emphasis in the state of Ohio, easily the most well-represented among commitments to date. And this class is growing very, very quickly. I think there's only 3 programs that, off the top of my head, have 20 verbal commitments. Cincinnati's one of them. I believe Northwestern and Texas Tech are the others. So some staffs trying to hit the ground running. But Cincinnati, in the month of June in particular, has been the hottest among them. And I do think that the focus in the secondary, especially relative to locals, and then down in the state of Florida, where you can always get great secondary talent, we've seen a strong push from the Bearcats. And then you throw in some legacy recruits like Daeh McCullough, who's the headliner, at least publicly right now, or in terms of rankings for UC. That certainly isn't a bad wrinkle to throw into the mix on top of these other great commitments. So the Bearcats are riding high, and this should be a celebrated recruiting class that is still got some room to add some more talent, but certainly the month of June has been the banner month for the Bearcats, and you can understand why relative to some of these positions.
Yeah, you mentioned Daeh McCullough. We'll get to him in a minute, but who else stands out? Why do you think so many players? Because, I remember the first weekend of June, it was, the 12 o'clock hour on a Saturday afternoon, and you get Daeh McCullough, and it's like, all right, great. And then the 3 o'clock hour hits, another one, 6 o'clock hour, another one, and then just that happens Saturday and Sunday. So who stands out, and why did so many players commit that first weekend, John?
Well, I do think in terms of the secondary, when a couple kids start to pop, there's always a sense of, hey, how many spots are left? How many DBs will a school like Cincinnati take? And we knew it would be a high number. Look, you lost great DBs. Naturally, you got to bring in another group of them. But I do think there's kind of a looking over the shoulder almost where you're like, okay, they can't take 10 DBs. So once 1, 2, 3 start to come off the board, if you're serious about the Bearcats, you kind of had to look internally and say, hey, I need to jump on board if this is a school I want to go to. So I do think that had something to do with, along with the visits, of course, had to do with why there were so many DBs in a short amount of time. And I think this is a great versatile group, a lot of different heights and weights with this crew. And one that I've seen in person lately that totally has my attention is Amare Snowden from up in the Michigan area. This kid is a unicorn. He looks like he could be a flex tight end, but then you watch him run and you see his range and you're like, oh my gosh, this is a legitimate safety, but maybe in a certain scheme or certain down and distance, you could line him up outside in the boundary, certainly in the red zone. I think he has more usage as a true corner. He can press, he can run, he's got ball skills. He is one of those that 6 months ago you said, hey, this kid's going to end up at Cincinnati. You would be like, he's got too much national attention to end up at Cincinnati. But I think conversely, I think the Bearcat profile in the secondary in particular and keeping regional kids home keeps Cincinnati in the mix with all the current Power 5 programs that were courting Snowden at a very high and consistent level. So physically, he's certainly the most intriguing of this entire group. He could also be the most versatile at the end of the day. So I'm fascinated to see not only where he begins his UC career, but where maybe he shifts depending on how big he gets, depending on how the defense expands, and obviously playing time available. Amare Snowden's a kid that in the next 3 years, we could see him line up at 3 different positions, and that shouldn't surprise you. And that's just not something we really ever say in college football recruiting.
Yeah. How about that? So why, John, are there so many corners that have committed to the University of Cincinnati recently? If there's something like, is there something writing on the wall we're not seeing? Why are there so many corners committed to Cincinnati for next year, John?
Well, I think as a modern college football recruiting analyst, you got to take as many corners as you can. And it doesn't mean they're all going to play corner, right? I mean, we just talked about Snowden. He's 6'3", 200 pounds. The likelihood of him playing corner 3 years from now is probably low. I mean, I think that's a safe bet. McCullough already more physically filled out and a safety type projection. So really, I think if you take those two out of the equation, you're talking about 3 corners, which is kind of a normal group of corners to take for UC. And there could be more on the way. But I do think that generally you want to take corners and move them to safety. That's just a natural position change. Just like on the offensive line, I'm seeing a lot of offensive line coaches taking a center type and then all tackles, because you're like, okay, whichever tackles don't cut it outside, we can always move them inside to guard. So I think there's a little bit of carryover when you look at defensive back prospects. If you can play corner in high school, you could probably work out to safety at some point. And it does kind of bend your evaluation a little bit, because now you're not going to take as many finesse corners, right? You need to take more bigger and more physical corners if you're thinking, hey, maybe I'm moving them to safety down the line. And that's what you see across the board. All these guys are 6 foot or better. All these guys are close to 200 pounds already. So I do think that that's part of the thinking where, hey, the cream will rise to the top at corner, but it doesn't mean the other guys are forgotten. We're going to move them to nickel. We're going to move them to safety. We're going to move them to rover. They're going to play all over the place, and that's what you have to have in this day and age, combating these spread offenses that line up 4 and 5 receivers at a time.
Especially in the Big 12, where Cincinnati will be heading in 1 year from this coming Friday. John Garcia Jr., the director of football recruiting for Sports Illustrated, my guest today on Locked On Bearcats. Our conversation will continue shortly. We'll talk about Daeh McCullough and if Cincinnati, in John's opinion, is becoming the next DBU. Our conversation will continue next, but first, a word, if I can pull up our ad calendar here. A word from, Rock Auto, because that is what this episode is brought to you by. With the ever-increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for you to go to your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. So why do you want to endure often pointless or seemingly intimidating questioning and wait while the person behind the counter orders the parts on their computer, but choosing the only brand their warehouse happens to carry? Well, you've got computers with access to rockauto.com and home and in your pocket. You can save time and money when using Rock Auto. It's a family business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years. Their prices are reliably low for every customer. They have everything you can need: brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, and even new carpet. Go explore their easy-to-use website today to find the solution to your auto part needs. RockAuto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck, and write Locked On in their How Did You Hear About Us box so that we know, or they know rather, we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. RockAuto.com. John Garcia Jr., the director of football recruiting for Sports Illustrated, friend of the show, friend of the college channel of the Locked On Podcast Network. So, John, Daeh McCullough committed Saturday, June 4th Very early commit during the official visit weekend, first weekend of June. What can you tell us about him?
I think this is a really polished safety prospect. Obviously, he's a coach's kid. His older brothers play in the Power Five as well. So you understand kind of the trickle down knowledge that he's been able to pick up. And I do think it shows on tape. It's not just something that on paper looks really good. McCullough is really comfortable navigating the wash. And I think that's a trait we often talk about with linebackers and defensive linemen. But I think when he's in the box at 6'2", 195 or so, he has that natural instinctive nature to trigger towards the football. But he's also got the experience behind it to navigate blockers, to beat blockers to the angle, and to meet ball carriers at or often behind the line of scrimmage. So I think as a downhill run first safety, he's got a ton to like and an extremely high floor. He could be a tone setting type safety, but what you love about him the more you watch is the coverage ability to balance that game where on third down, yeah, you could send him on a blitz, surely, but I do think he's got the size and physicality to cover a tight end, to cover a bigger wide receiver, to zone up and play the apex or the catch point against a bigger wide receiver who may be receiving a 50-50 ball or a back shoulder ball. There's just a lot of savvy in McCullough's game to where his floor screams that it's very, very high going into the next level. Still has, of course, another year of high school ball to play, but you just love where his game is at right now. And you kind of get curious, though, right? Because Dasan, his older brother, was like 6'4", 6'5". So you wonder with Daeh at 6'2", is he still growing? Is he still going to get that much taller? I do think that could begin to influence his position projection. But right now, I think he's a balanced downhill safety type who can help you in coverage as well. But if he gets bigger, maybe he becomes a more permanent in the box type player. But that remains to be seen. But again, I think regardless of how his frame fills out, I think he's a guy who you see early during his time at Cincinnati. Again, coach's kid, multi-year starter at a high level from a varsity standpoint, and again, a tone-setting guy at the contact point. And that's something you still need, even in this finesse nature of college football.
Polished and a lot of savvy in his game. John, are you saying that he's an immediate starter when he sets foot on UC's campus in 2023?
It's hard to project, especially with a team that's, look, a top 10 type team in the country the last few years. That's really hard to project. So I'd have to get a little bit more familiar with the current roster and see how this season goes, of course. But yeah, I mean, I think in general, if you think of some of these commitments, seeing the field early, remember, that doesn't always have to be as a starter or a guy who's playing the spot we think he's going to play. I think situationally, you think sub-defenders, nickel types who are coming in to aid against a spread look. I do think there could be some specialty roles for McCullough as a true freshman, 100%. That combined with his body and how he develops could very much tweak where we see him impacting the roster as early as 2023. But all things even, on a normal college roster, absolutely. I think his floor is high enough to where you could potentially see him, if not start, certainly contribute heavily as a true freshman.
Well, then again, the last corner who came in and, you said that Daeh McCullough is still growing. Well, that reminds me of a guy named Sauce Gardner who was still growing through his time throughout Cincinnati. And he was what, John, 6th on the depth chart? Yes, he was 6th on the depth chart in 2019. Well, he ultimately was a freshman All-American that year. Just, I've always wondered, John, what do you remember when Sauce was in the recruiting process, when he was in high school up in Detroit? What do you remember about him, and what were your thoughts on him during the recruiting process coming out of high school and into Cincinnati?
Yeah, to be frank, Alex, not a whole lot. I remember him as a huge DB that made a lot of people wonder, kind of like we talked about with Snowden, can he stay at corner? I mean, that's just such a natural question to ask when you see a kid who's even 6'1" or 6'2" in this day and age. About a year ago, I was doing some NFL comparisons for some of these top recruits, and it came across my page just how rare it is for big corners to make it in the NFL. Your Sauce Gardners, your Richard Shermans, your Brandon Browners. There was only at that time that I researched, I think 4 DBs 6'2" or better starting at corner in the NFL. It is such a rarity. So I remember asking that question because it's just, again, the numbers and the odds say it's really hard to do, but obviously he hit the ground running and just became so comfortable despite having such a unusual frame at the position to where he didn't even allow a touchdown as a junior. I mean, it is something that, we certainly didn't forecast, but I just remember asking the same question I'm sure a lot of others were asking, just how sustainable is corner for a kid like this? And if that answer is very sustainable, it means you're just a special athlete. And that's something that, again, is really hard to project from the high school ranks. And no disrespect to Detroit or the state of Michigan, but look, you don't get the coverage you would get in Atlanta, in Orlando, in Miami, in Texas, in California. You don't have the scouts around to get that full-bodied evaluation over multiple years. You might just see the kid once or twice, and that's kind of it. And that's where we were with Snowden. We've only seen him once or twice. We like him. We're intrigued, but we don't know as much as maybe we should about prospects from certain areas of the country. It's just kind of a casualty of the recruiting process to date.
So you're saying that there aren't a lot of corners who are taller than 6'2". Is that where you're getting at?
In the NFL, in terms of starters, I did it about a year ago. There was only 5. There was only 5 starters that were that tall in the NFL. So it is extremely rare. We usually don't like to play the height and weight game because everybody's different. We all know that. But there is something to be said for precedent, right? Just like in law, it carries into recruiting. It carries into our evaluations. We have to use precedent. So think of receivers before Tyreek Hill. We used to always put this premium on height over basically everything else. And if you were under 6 foot, you had to be extraordinary elsewhere. And I think Tyreek Hill and some of these unicorns in the game, Richard Sherman at corner, certainly have started to change our mind on some of these positions because athletically they can hold up despite being bigger or, in Hill's case, smaller than what convention tells us. So you got to track the data of what you have, but you also have to keep an open mind at the same time. But we're human, so it's hard sometimes.
Yeah. So when we're talking about shutdown corners, John, which is who Sauce Gardner was, it's hopefully who Daeh McCullough and Amare Snowden are going to be. So if a corner is a few inches shorter than, because, I mean, there are still receivers in the NFL who are 6'4", 6'5", I mean, even 6'6". So what do you look for in a corner who is shorter by several inches than a receiver that makes you say, yes, he's a shutdown corner. Yes, he's effective. I can put him one-on-one against this big-bodied receiver like an Odell Beckham, like a Mike Williams of the Chargers, for instance. What makes you say in a corner, yes, he's shut down, he can go up against anybody?
I think 10 years ago, it was about hips, length, and technique. Maybe speed was a big part of that conversation as well, but it's shifted to length is still kind of the first thing we talk about, but it's more about physicality. Can you reroute? Can you disrupt the timing at the line of scrimmage? And how do you play the football? And I think that is where we've seen the biggest change in perception around the cornerback position, because it is about takeaways and passes broken up. It used to be Darrelle Revis, right? It's like no catches allowed, just absurdly talented and polished to where you couldn't even create any separation. Now it's like you can have separation, but if you've got an Antonio Cromartie type, it might not matter because he's so tall, so long, and his ball skills are so good that it just isn't the same value as it once was. And obviously the game is pass first, certainly now compared to 10 or 15 years ago. So those turnovers, those changes are more important and critical towards dictating who wins a game, much more so than, hey, did he allow a catch today? You're going to give up passes. You're going to play a lot more zone with more receivers on the field. So it's more about the ground you can cover, the length that is associated with it, the ability to compete at the line of scrimmage, and most importantly, how you play the football when it's in the air. That's why a lot of the greatest corners played receiver in high school or have experience playing offense because it gives you kind of that natural inclination into what the opposition wants to do.
Yeah, and those are great observations, John, as always. On the other side, I want to ask you, what other recruits stand out? Because there are still a lot of recruits in the trenches, which we know that's what Cincinnati prides their football program on. So I'll ask you about that. And then I got a fun question to ask you. as we wrap up today's show. But first, I got to tell you all about Bet Online, because they are your number one source for all of your betting needs and sports info. Find all of the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including this year's NHL Stanley Cup playoffs, which just concluded. Congratulations to the Colorado Avalanche on their Stanley Cup victory, and Major League Baseball. There are some incredible races in that sport right now. BetOnline is your continued source for all of your sporting wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. And BetOnline.net remains the best spot for all of your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite sports and events, including MMA, boxing, and golf. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Good to have John Garcia Jr., the director of football recruiting for Sports Illustrated and friend of the Locked On Podcast Network, back with us today here on Locked On Bearcats. My name's Alex Frank, if you don't see it on the screen, but I'm sure you do. Anyway, but this is about John, because he is a recruiting guru, and that's to put it lightly. So, John, we know that this Bearcats football program is driven through its trenches, the offensive and defensive lines. There have been some great recruits in the Fickle era at those positions. As far as the players who've committed, or recruits who have committed this month, who stands out to you in the trenches?
Well, yeah, I mean, you see so many new offensive linemen verbally committed. I think that's the group that you kind of naturally gravitate towards. And there's one that I'm really familiar with James Jenkins out of Tampa, Carrollwood Day School, 6'5", 285 or so. This is the kind of body type we've seen not only Cincinnati, but a lot of programs gravitate towards. You used to say the bigger the better, right? 340-pound guys. Hey, we'll mold them and we'll trim them down once we get them. Now it's kind of the opposite thinking, right? These pass rushers are smaller, faster, quicker. So these longer, lighter, leaner, lighter on their feet offensive tackles are more coveted up front. So with Jenkins, you see that in his game, playing really great competition, even at his own practice at Carrollwood Day, which has 6, 7, 8 Division I, Power 5 type recruits throughout the offense and the defense there. So I do like where his game is at now. I talked to the source close to him yesterday, and he said, man, this kid is always in the gym. He's just kind of that classic grunt of an offensive lineman, traits that you want to hear associated with your guys. Because, again, this isn't a kid that you have to ask to get in the gym and have him cut down on the body fat and trim up a little bit. He's already trim. If anything, he's adding bulk, and good bulk, to his 6'5", 6'6" frame. So I like where his game has been, but with his mentality, and once he gets to a collegiate level program as high a level as Cincinnati, I think he will add that good mass and play at 290, 295 and be ready to go as a tackle, or perhaps a swing prospect who's got some guard upside. We talked about DBs that can move around. You need that on the O-line. You need that at receiver. You need it almost everywhere on the field. So I think Jenkins offers some versatility and flexibility with the future of that Cincinnati offensive line.
Yeah. I mean, I'm looking at James Jenkins, and the fact that he comes from Tampa, I think you have to like that, John, because you've talked about on this show the Bearcats dipping into other areas of the country, and that's right near UCF's future Big 12 opponent, their backyard. I'm looking at, Nick Oliveira. I'm looking at Joshua Gregory. And I believe those are all the offensive linemen that I have so far. But it's just the fact that they're still putting an emphasis on the trenches that stands out to me. So you mentioned that receivers are a little smaller now. You still have your big-bodied receivers, but like one receiver, you mentioned Tyreek Hill. I'll throw another one in there, Jamar Chase. What, just for the fun of it, because, this is a Cincinnati Bearcats podcast, but, Bearcats fans are also Bengals fans. Just real quick, what do you remember the most when Jamar Chase was in the recruiting process?
The first time I saw Jamar was at Friday Night Lights at Florida. He was committed to the Gators at the time. I believe this was under Jim McElwain before they moved on to Dan Mullen. And I remember just seeing him, it was just T-shirt and shorts, and I was like, this is a high school kid? His lower body was so well built and defined to where you're like, man, this is a strong safety or a running back, not a wide receiver. And obviously he emphasized that and got better with his body distribution at LSU. But his route running, his ball skills just really stood out kind of always. This wasn't a sleeper. This wasn't a developmental recruit. This is a kid that you were just like, man, he is so physically ready to make an impact early at the next level, almost wherever he goes. And again, at the time, he was a Gator commitment. He tore up the camp. He's just so dominant physically. And I think that's something we don't talk about enough with receivers. You know, we talk about it with DBs a ton, right? Can you play at the catch point? Can you play at the line of scrimmage? But receivers who, when they're at the top of the route, their lower body build creates such a sharp and fast cut and oftentimes leverage against the defensive back, or it gets him to flip his hips. That's so valuable because that's the name of the game, right? Separation. And Jamar was so ahead of the curve physically at the high school level. He was probably 195 pounds as a junior the first time I saw him. And you just wondered how big he was going to get and how it was going to be sustained at the next level. Obviously, there was no worry thereafter once he got to LSU, and that 2019 team and his run that year is something that we'll probably be talking about for a very long time.
So let's switch this up here then with Cincinnati. We know they're excellent at recruiting corners, but wide receivers, Trey Tucker, Tyler Scott, Nick Martiner. Which receiver on this roster do you think, based on what you've seen in the recruiting processes, is going to stand out on this year's Bearcats team?
Oh, man, it's early. It's early. I think Martin's got some balance to his game. I think when you recruit any receiver nowadays, Alex, you've got to bring the production with it. So I do think that Martin could have a little bit of upside there. But it's tough. It's tough. It's a new group, right? I mean, I think that's true for Cincinnati at a lot of positions. And I think the development at that position, we see big jumps year one to year two. We just talked about Jamar Chase, right? Year one, promising. He flashed. You were certainly excited to see him in 2019, but man, what a jump he made as a sophomore in 2019. So I think a lot of these guys playing behind NFL players, that will help them boost forward going into next year. So I could be more well-versed and researched here, and maybe I'll eat some crow down the line. But I do think that the young core of this receiver group is going to be good for UC, regardless of who the quarterback is, though. You know who I think should be the guy.
You know who I think should be the guy, too, and we're in agreement on that. Well, John, I seriously hope to have you back on the show next week, because if we are able to, we're going to talk about the defensive line for Cincinnati. And there's one player in particular, Eric Phillips, who I'm going to ask you about, because I think he could be poised for a breakout season this year for the Cincinnati Bearcats. So we'll get to that next week. John Garcia Jr., the director of football recruiting for Sports Illustrated. He's on the road as always. John, you're at the Elite 11 in Los Angeles right now?
Yeah. I'm going to see the UC quarterback of the future, Brady Drogosh, for the first time. This was the event last year that Luther Richardson really captivated, all of our attention. So we're curious to see if Brady can follow it up out here in LA against a really loaded field. So we'll report back with the news here soon.
Absolutely. John Garcia Jr., the director of football recruiting for Sports Illustrated, joining me today, our weekly conversation on recruiting regarding the Cincinnati Bearcats. John, thank you, and have fun in Los Angeles.
Sounds good, Alex. Thanks for having me again.
John Garcia Jr., always a pleasure having him on. Tomorrow, Russ Heltman, my colleague from All Bearcats, will join me. We'll talk about more about the defensive line, players who he thinks could break out this season, in addition to the big three of Malik Van, Juwan Briggs, and Jabari Taylor. As always, you can follow me on Twitter at Frankie_Natty with 2 N's, NNATI. You can follow me on Instagram, AlexFrank9_, or email me at alex3frank@gmail.com. Don't forget to subscribe to the Locked On Bearcats YouTube channel, which I last check is up to 236 subscribers and counting. Follow us, too, to get an alert every time we drop a new episode. And now for your second listen, make it Locked On Big 12. Locked On Big 12, everyday host Josh Neighbors and the local experts of Locked On take you across the league in 30 minutes. Locked On Big 12, make it your second listen. Thanks for making us Locked On Bearcats your first listen every day. For the Locked On Bearcats podcast, I'm Alex Frank. Have a great rest of your Tuesday. Or Wednesday, excuse me. I'll be back tomorrow with Russ Heltman of All Bearcats, my colleague. And until then, I'm Alex Frank for the Locked On Bearcats podcast, and have a great rest of your Wednesday.